The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody, and this is Mike Froning from Vision New England. I am the Marketing and Communications Director at Vision New England. We're very excited that you are able to attend this morning our free monthly webinar series. We're really excited to bring to you a great topic on learning to utilize a living system in your ministry plan. And we're very lucky to have a great speaker today. But before we get started, wanted to run through a couple of quick logistics so we're all on the same page. We are going to do our best to be completed right at 10:45 because we know your time is valuable. So, and one of the things I just wanted to accentuate is that this webinar is really for you. And to that end, if you have any questions, feel free to interject right away. Our panelist has decided that, he will stop his presentation to answer questions and maybe even just tweak the plan around your questions. So it's really important that you feel comfortable in using the tool. You can ask questions in a couple ways. First thing you could do is actually interject with a chat comment. There should be a chat button on your little panel there to the right-hand side, and you also could type out a formal question. Or you could raise your hand. There's a raise your hand function as well. So feel free to use any one of those three, and I will be in the background fielding questions and answering them and passing them along accordingly. So the presenter won't see those questions until I pass them on. So again, feel free to field any questions you might have, and we're going to get started. So we have with us Jeff Bass, who's the Executive Director at Emmanuel Gospel Center in Boston. And he actually teaches this very topic at Conwell Seminary, so we're really excited to have him today. Jeff, welcome to our webinar series.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here today.
Good stuff. We'll get going.
All right. So can you advance? Are you advancing the slides? There you go. So welcome, everybody. I'm glad you're here. I'm here today to talk about living system ministry, a concept that's been developed by the Emmanuel Gospel Center really over the last 50 years based on our experience with ministry. It's a pretty big topic, and so we'll really only be scratching the surface today, but I'm hoping that what we'll do will be helpful. I'm trying to make some of this very practical, but also trying to give you some good background as well. Living systems is not a turnkey kind of thing that you just sort of take it and apply it like really easily. It's actually something you need to think about and work on, and it's really a different way of thinking. So I want to get started, introduce you to the topic today, and hopefully it will stimulate some good thinking in your ministry and in your churches. So I've been the Executive Director of EGC for a long time, so I thought I'd start by telling you a little bit about EGC so you can see the context from which this develops. You see this slide here. We took the recent photo of the staff of EGC. And so like your church, it's the people that really define the ministry. And so I just wanted to give a feeling for who we are. And what we do at EGC can be summarized in 3 verbs. So next slide, Mike. So these verbs are learn, connect, and equip. And this really is what we call our living system ministry process, so how we do living system ministry. We learn about the city. We take time to understand the systems in which we operate, the church, the neighborhoods, how the city's changing. We're always in the mode of being a learner. As we do that, we connect, we get to know people, we connect the dots of stories, we try to understand what's happening, facilitating strong relationships, and as we develop those relationships and as we bring sort of what we're learning to the table, we get behind Christian leaders and equip them to do effective ministry. And so, and as we equip, stay back there please, as we equip, we learn more. And so there's a flow to this. And so the arrows show the interrelationship between learning, connecting, and equipping. But this process, this sort of, the work that it takes is really what living system ministry feels like. We always need to be staying as learners. We always need to develop relationships. And we always need to be trying to apply it as we go. And so we do this, next slide, in the various ministries of the center. We do research. We address various church systems, intercultural ministry. We do various areas of issue areas, homelessness, human trafficking. We're applying living system ministry all the time in these areas. So let's start thinking about living system ministry a little bit. And I'm going to start by introducing you to a simple system, sort of, but it's really, if Next slide, Mike. It's really a quiz. And so I've never done this quiz on a webinar before, so we'll see how this works. We're going to try it with a little poll. And so if you bear with me and see how this works. So the rules are, next slide, if you're with other people, don't give people your answers. I know there's a few of you that are watching this in a group. And I'm just going to show a slide in a second, not yet, Mike, but when I do, I'm going to ask you to count how many times the letter F appears on the next slide. All right, so everybody, when the slide comes up, take 20 to 30 seconds to count the F's, don't tell people, and then we'll put the poll up after that. So if we could put the slide up so it doesn't block the poll. Okay, I see the poll but not the slide.
Here you go.
What do you see, Stacy? So we see the poll, Mike, not the slide itself.
Oh, interesting. Poll must be closed to enable screen sharing. Okay, so why don't we show the screen and then I'll close the poll. I'll open the poll. So you should see the screen now.
I see not the screen. I see, you do? I'm going to need to see it too.
All right, so how many F's do you see? Here, I'm going to open the poll again.
Okay. So if you could respond to the poll now and click on, I see poll results now. Is the poll still open?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
So 100% of the people are saying 4.
All right. Okay. Okay, so I'm not sure how well that worked, but I'm assuming that we got a similar result to what I got. I've done this slide over the years with all kinds of groups, and typically many people see 3 Fs, some people see 4 Fs, some people see 5 Fs, a few people see 6 Fs. I've had some people see 2 and 7. When I do it with a group of 30, 40 people, you get probably 60% of them seeing 3. And what's interesting is that people see different things in something that's so simple. So if you go to the next slide, there are in fact 6 Fs on the slide. And so if you didn't see 6, just take a second to see if you can see them, okay? Because even knowing that there's 6 Fs, if you don't see the 6 Fs, it's really hard to see. So I'll give you just 1 second to do that. Again, it would be easier if I had to make eye contact and see what you guys were really thinking. But what happens is that people don't see the ofs. And so if you're wired so that you've learned to read, you see the of as an of, it's impossible to see the F in the of because your brain sees the of and not the F, even though you know there's Fs there. And so when I did this for the first time, I saw 3, and I read it backwards. I could not see those Fs. Go to the next slide, please. And so what can we learn from this? So the point I'm trying to make is that even in simple systems, things aren't as easy as they seem. It's really easy to misunderstand. It's easy to make mistakes. Systems aren't trivial. And so if we have a hard time seeing how many Fs are on a page, something that you think a kindergartner could do, but as a group it's really hard to do that, how much more difficult would it be to see what's really happening in a city or in a family or in a church? And so it shows us the need for humility as we approach systems. And the side thing, or another important element of this, is it also shows us that we need to have diverse perspectives on systems. If you're in a room of 40 people and people see 3, 4, 5, 6 Fs, you think, what's going on here? We're all seeing different things. But if you actually talked about it and got each other's input, it'd be pretty easy in that simple system to come to a better answer as a group than you could get by yourself. And so anyway, I just think it's a fun way to start thinking about systems, just to kind of start with this place of humility. And so let's start talking about what a living system is. And what I'd like to do this is use our classic approach, which is to talk about the cat and the toaster. And so if you were here live with me, I would pick up a toaster, and I have a toaster that I keep with me for this purpose. I have it at all times. And I would put the toaster down in front of you. And so you need to do this now as a mind exercise. So think about this. I'm putting a toaster down in front of you. And the toaster is broken. Okay? So what would you do with the broken toaster? Okay? So what you probably do with the broken toaster is you pick it up and look at it. You may plug it in, verify that it's broken. You would probably take a screwdriver and take it apart. I've been told that if you take a mechanical thing like a toaster apart and clean all the parts and put it back together, that it would generally work. You'd put it on your workbench. You might decide it needs a new heating element. You go to the internet. You'd order a new heating element. You'd wait 2 weeks. The toaster would just sit there while you're waiting, and then you would put the new element in, plug it in, and hopefully you'd have toast. Or if you couldn't figure out how to fix it, you might just throw the toaster away, because toasters aren't that valuable anyway. You could buy a toaster for $5 at Goodwill or probably even at the store. All right, so that's a toaster. Now, take the toaster away, and so in your mind, imagine me putting a live cat in front of you, and your cat is sick. What are you going to do? Do you see how it's different than the toaster? So are you going to take a screwdriver to the cat and take it apart? What would happen if you did that? You would kill the cat. You can't do that with a cat. Stay on the previous slide, please, Mike. And so if the cat's sick, the cat will let you know it's sick. You probably would want to go to a veterinarian and get some actual. You wouldn't just throw away the cat and get a new cat. And if you started to approach the cat with your screwdriver, the cat would probably scratch you and defend itself. If you put the cat on your tool bench, it would probably jump off and would not want to cooperate with what you're doing with it. And so cats behave very differently than toasters. And so one of the fundamental points of living systems is that God makes cats and not toasters. People make toasters. God creates cats. So the systems that we work in, our churches, our families, our neighborhoods, behave more like cats than like toasters. And we need to treat them differently as a result. So let's think about that a little more deeply. So what besides cats are living systems? Okay, so let's think a little more about living systems. So you can think about physical systems. So a good analogy for a physical system is your body. And your body is made up of many different systems. We have pictures here. Think of the skeletal system, the muscular system, the cardiovascular system, and the little guy, I think, is supposed to be the nervous system. And all these systems are working together in your body in very complex and interconnected ways. And so physical systems are living systems. So God makes all the complexity of these living systems. But it's also important to understand that social systems are living systems. And so families and churches and neighborhoods and cities are living systems, okay? So this, when a complex group comes together, interacts, interrelates as a unified whole, it's a living system. And so because humans are complex living systems, we need to relate to them in a way that's consistent with their living system design, okay? So you buy that your church is a living system. You can't bring our programs and our toaster approaches to the church. We really need to understand it and get to know it. So let's think about the similarity of, next slide please, of living systems. So what can we learn from physical systems that would help us understand social systems? So I think it's easier for us to understand this when we think about social systems, maybe a little bit when we think about cats. But what are some of the characteristics of physical systems that are also shared by complex social systems? And again, if you were here live, I would ask you to talk about these things. We'd write them on the board. But let me just give you a list of things that I think are relevant here that you can look at. So next slide, please. So living systems, be they physical systems or social systems, are created by God. God makes living systems. They have a purpose. God made them for a purpose. Even your cat, I believe, has a purpose. But God clearly says he makes people for a purpose and builds churches and cities for a purpose. They have immune systems. They will defend themselves. So if you enter into them badly, they will defend themselves. They'll make it very difficult. Systems can become sick. Systems that are sick can heal. Systems need nutrients to grow and stay healthy. Systems can die. And they have the interrelated and interdependent parts that you can't just disconnect and put on a shelf and expect them to work right. You have to really understand how these things work together. And so living systems are highly complex. Does that make sense? I hope you're staying with me with that. So living systems, your church, your neighborhood, as you try to understand it, I want you to understand that they are living systems that have these characteristics. In order to work with them effectively, we need to respect these characteristics. And they're actually hard to see, but they're very real, and it's very important to approach systems in this way. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about how living systems behave. Okay? And this is a pretty big topic to get into, and it's something that, again, we'll just touch on today. But I want to give you a helpful insight in thinking about systems. We have this diagram, which is a pyramid, I guess, or a triangle. You can think of it, I like to think of it as an iceberg. And so the brown part that says events is the tip of the iceberg. And so the events, the things that you see in life are the above the water, okay? It's the things you react to. We tend to spend a lot of our time in our churches, in our ministries, in our families especially, reacting to events. But the events, there's something deeper that's happening below that. And there's patterns that we can identify. And we tend to see trends that are developing. And, you know, kids misbehave a certain time of day. And we sort of, anyway, so there's a pattern that is behind the event. But even deeper below that, there's structure in the system. There's the ways people think. There's rules. There's a structure to the system that creates the pattern that makes the event happen. So if we spend all our time reacting to the event and don't notice the pattern, we're never going to see the underlying structure, and the power comes in changing the structure. If you want to see a different result, just responding to the event, just being dominated by the tyranny of the urgent, just reacting to what's happening won't get you anywhere, really. And I think you've all experienced that. If you want to see change, you have to go deeper and understand the pattern. And if you really want to see change, you have to go deeper and understand the system structures. So an example of this is at a staff meeting, we at EGC, we have, you know, you saw the picture of our staff. There's about 35 people. We all have snacks in a different room than we have staff meetings. And so my job had been, and I've changed this, but what had been to get people to move from the snack room to the main room when it's time to start. And people just wouldn't want to come. And every week I get frustrated because I would try to get people to come. And one day I just snapped and yelled at people. I said, will you just get in the other room? And people were like shocked that I yelled at them, and they went in, but I had to like apologize. And so I reacted to the event by yelling. So then I started thinking about what's the pattern here. And so I realized that people are enjoying each other. This is actually a very healthy thing that's happening. And so I started thinking about what could I do to change the structure in order to have this work. So what I did was I realized that because people are relating socially, and I have certain leaders in the group, I knew that if I could get a few of the leaders to respond when I said, please come to the other room, everyone else would come too. And so I pulled 3 or 4 people aside and said, hey, listen, when I come in and say, it's time to move to the other room, would you just start moving and bring other people with you? And so the next week I came in, I did that, and everyone just flowed right in. So I changed the structure of the system, okay? And a second example would be at my church, we're trying to understand sort of our core purpose. And I've been frustrated that the leadership of the church a few years ago was very inconsistent in talking about the purpose. So that frustrated me. I started just getting emotional about it. I would get sort of angry at people for no apparent reason. But I noticed a pattern that every time we said the mission, we said it differently. It would be published in the bulletin one way, the pastor would say it a different way, we'd talk about it in a meeting a different way. And so I realized that part of our structure needs to be to get a consistent consensus in the church around a shared vision, if you will, around our mission, vision, and values. And so we did that, and then it just sort of changed the behavior. Now we're sort of flowing together and working together on this. So it's a matter of getting deeper. So I hope you see what this looks like. Next slide, please. So this is actually very difficult. Everyone who writes about systems thinking says this is easy to say. You've got to understand system structure. But seeing the structure in systems is actually it's hard. It's hard work, and it takes work to do it. And so if we find ourselves in firefighting mode and just responding to crisis, we need to try to go deeper and understand the patterns and the trends that are happening. But we need to go deeper than that and try to understand the elements of structure. And on the slide, the green part shows the different things that could be at play. So it could be some emotions need to be addressed. It could be some hot buttons that need to be disconnected. It could be written rules or unwritten rules or procedures. A powerful one often in the right corner there is people's mental models, how people are thinking. They're saying one thing, but they're thinking somewhat else. If you can get at the really articulating and identifying how people are thinking, you can start to change what's happening. But the power of systems thinking is getting in and getting below the surface, below that iceberg, to stop reacting to what's happening and trying to understand why it's happening and try to understand what the control mechanisms are, what's the structure of the system, and try to figure out what we can change to change the structure so that we get a different result going forward. And again, this is not a turnkey kind of thing. It's not like, oh, just do this. It actually takes a lot of learning and a lot of trial and error. It takes, again, a diverse perspective. You'll do better doing this in a group with other people talking about it. But I'm going to give you a couple tools that will help you with this. So talking about how do we work, next slide please, how do we work in living systems, okay? And so I put together on the next slide a tool map. And so this is a tool map. It's arranged from left to right, so the three sections: low engagement, medium engagement, high engagement, meaning how much work it is to really do these things in terms of how connected to the system you need to be. And then from bottom to top, it's low expertise to high expertise. And so the ones that are higher up are more difficult to do and take much more training, and the ones more to the right are things that take a lot more engagement. So immersion is a great way to learn about the system. If you want to learn about people in the inner city, move to the inner city. And that immersion, you'll learn a lot about the system that you can't learn by visiting or by coming from the outside. Now, obviously not everyone can do that in every setting, but a lot of what we need to do is get to know the system. Remember, we're trying to, it's not a cat, it's not a toaster, it's a cat. You've got to get to know it, understand it. And so getting to know things actually takes time. You also notice that research is at all three levels. There's research in the low engagement, medium engagement, high engagement. That's because there's different kinds of research you can do. So there's high engagement research where you can hire people and do studies and surveys, but there's also low engagement research where you can just sort of walk around the neighborhood and get a feel for it. And you'll gain insight into the system, into the structure as you do that. The pastors, if you're just meeting with your staff and not talking with your church members, that's research when you're actually talking to people and you're understanding the system as a result. So I'm going to drill into two tools that I think are actually easy to learn and are very powerful. And I don't want you to be put off by how simple they are. These tools will change how you do business if you apply them well. So the first tool is we call at EGC asking system questions. And so it's really simple. Our standard way we're wired is, how do I get the job done? How does my church reach this part of town? How am I going to do outreach ministry? Instead, what we want to do is ask a system question which says, how does the job get done? How will people be reached? What is needed for these people to come to the Lord? It's not how do I do it, it's how does the job get done? And so an example of that is, my church is in Jamaica Plain, and we'll be much more effective at reaching Jamaica Plain if we ask the question, not how does my church reach Jamaica Plain for Christ, but how will JP be reached for Christ? And this is interesting that I'm using this as an example because I had a conversation last night. I met a church planter, or a guy who's involved in a church plant in Jamaica Plain, and he was telling me what his church was doing for outreach. And we're trying to figure this out and figure that out, and we have this little plan we're going to do. And what he said he was going to do was something that our church did a few years ago and didn't work very well. And I asked him, have you connected with Heart Change and Covenant and River of Life and the other churches in Jamaica Plain to think together about reaching Jamaica Plain? And it hadn't occurred to him to do that. But he got right away that was a good thing to do. And so I was encouraging him essentially to ask a system question, not how can he and his little church reach Jamaica Plain for Christ, but what would it take to see Jamaica Plain be reached for Christ? And it shows that we have to work more holistically with the system. We have to understand it better. We have to connect to it better. So just asking the question differently will lead you to different results. Okay? And so and we see this over and over again. So we're always trying to answer system questions at EGC and encourage people to ask system questions instead of saying, how do I do it? Okay? So that's the first tool, is asking systems questions. And I would, again, just encourage you, don't dismiss that. It sounds really simple, but try it. Try asking the question differently in a meeting and see that you get different results. I guarantee you'll get different results if you do that. All right, the second tool is called bot graphs, and I've stolen these 3 slides from my friend Stephen Peterson with his permission. So Steve is a professor at Dartmouth College. He teaches systems thinking to Dartmouth students, and he also runs a consulting firm that does pretty high-level systems dynamics consulting with major governments. He worked for the Army and helped General Petraeus figure out things. Anyway, so he does high-level stuff. But this is one of his tools that I really like, and it's called bot graph. So it really gets into dynamic thinking. So it takes you down that pyramid. If you find yourself reacting to why is this happening, dynamic thinking is saying, let's look at the pattern, okay? And so instead of seeing things as a point in time, let's try to understand what's happening as a pattern, okay? And so it helps you get to where you want to go. So the value of this is it gets you out of the weeds. You're not just so much overwhelmed by the detail. You're sort of taking a step back and saying, well, what is happening? Why is it happening? How is it happening over time, okay? It also would encourage you to essentially put a stake in the ground around data. You actually have to get a little bit more information. So you realize that attendance is low at church this Sunday. Well, how's it been over the last few weeks? Is it going up? Is it going down? Well, I don't know. Well, but we tend to emotionally respond to what we see in the moment. Let's get some information. Let's try to figure this out. So it moves you towards data, and it gets you into this generative process, this getting into the system structure, and trying to figure out why things are happening. So the next slide has some examples of some bot graphs, and it's really this is very simple. It's not rocket science. It's just putting on a graph. So if you look at the one on the right, the x-axis, the horizontal one parallel to the table, is time. So in a bot graph, it's a behavior over time graph. The bottom axis is always time, and the top axis, the axis that goes up, the y-axis, is the thing that you want to measure. Okay? And you can do this, you can plot some data, you can estimate data, and you can also predict. And so you can look at what's happened, and you can think about what you'd like it to be. But just thinking in this way, again, gives you insight into the system. So we're trying to figure out what can I give you that will help you actually practically move from down that pyramid, from being reactive into understanding the patterns, because as you start to understand the pattern, you can start to ask questions about why is that happening. And that will get you some insight, I hope, into some of the structure of the system, because that's really the goal, is try to understand what's happening. So in the one on the left, Steve circled the little part in the graph that's just behaving funny. And so we'd say, well, why do we get this big dip right here? And when you drill in to look at the 1993, 94, what was happening that was different than was happening in other times? Okay, so however you do it, if you go to the next slide, if I had you live, I would take 10 minutes to do this. I can't do this now, but I'm proposing this as an exercise that you can do offline when we're done. So take a chart like this, have the bottom axis be time, have the top axis be the y-axis be something that you're interested in, and see if you can graph it. See if you can just, again, don't worry about precision. Give it a sense of flow. I think the little example at the bottom, Steve was trying to be funny. He's talking about your blood alcohol level. People get drunk and party. So this is his Dartmouth student slide. So sorry about that. But anyways, but if you take a thing like this, you can take 10 minutes and together think about some issue you're interested in and try to graph it over time and see what insight that produces. And I'll give you an example on the next slide of something where this is extremely powerful for the Emmanuel Gospel Center. So in 1993, I started work here in 1991, and people were asking the question, why is the church in Boston dying? And because everyone felt like things were bad. And so we'd actually been studying the church for years, and we had been doing church directory work since the mid-'80s, and we had data, but we never plotted it. We'd never done a bot graph of it. And so we put our church directory data, and we actually went back and got some historical data, and we tried to figure out how is the church in Boston changing compared to the population. And you see, since 1975, 1980 or so, this dramatic growth of the church that nobody realized was happening. They didn't see it because it didn't feel like it was happening, because it was happening in storefront churches, in immigrant communities. The big church with the steeple wasn't doing well. Honestly, the white church wasn't doing as well. The mainline denominations weren't doing well, but the immigrant churches, the black church, there was a lot of growth happening in the parts of the church that weren't on the radar of a lot of people. And so by plotting this graph, we could demonstrate this quiet revival dynamic that we've been talking about for years. The God's at work in Boston in some really interesting ways, and we could look at that part of the graph. Why is that happening? And so you start to look at the structure of church planting and sort of what's happening. It's led to a lot of great questions. Because this one goes through 2005, that line has continued through 2015. But we also think about what could happen. I don't have a chart here that shows that, but we think about, will it plateau? Will it keep growing like this? Will it decline? What does that mean? What would it take for that to happen? And so you can see how a bot graph gets you into thinking about the system in new ways. It leads to this sort of pushing you down that pyramid into understanding what's happening. Okay? So I hope those two tools are very helpful to you. And if you go to the next slide. So that's basically an introduction to living system ministry. Remember that your church is more like a cat than a toaster, and think about that analogy. You can derive many of the principles of living system ministry by thinking about the difference between a cat and a toaster. God makes living things. We need to respect the living dynamics and work with them and not be afraid of the complexity. Let's not try to simplify things because we understand how a toaster works. We want to just have a simple program. Now let's really try to understand how to work in the complexity of what God's doing. Remember that systems have structure. That you need to go deeper. If you find yourself reacting to events, if you find yourself yelling at your kids, why am I yelling at them? Okay. What's the pattern I'm seeing? And what rules could I change? What structure could I change to diffuse that situation? So try to dig into the structure of the system. Try to understand that. And you can do that in two ways. One is by asking system questions. So not how do I do the job, but how does the job get done? That will lead you down a different road and will get you in touch with more of the systemic dynamics. And then also bot graphs. Plotting, literally sitting down and plotting with the graph, how you think it works over time, that will also give you helpful insights. This page gives some resources if you'd like to learn more about this. We have The Cat and the Toaster, which is the book we wrote about. This sort of goes through all the ways we've learned about this and some of this thinking in depth. I like the book Thinking in Systems by Donnell and Meadows. I think it's a great introduction to systemic thought. It's a pretty short book. If you have a little more energy and want to do something bigger, The Fifth Discipline by Peter Senge is a classic. It gets into how systems thinking applies in organizational systems. I also like When Helping Hurts, which gets into counterproductivity, which is a big part of this, and it shows how our poster-like excursions into systems can actually do more harm than good. And so there's a lot of systemic insight, although it's not a book about systems per se, but there's a lot of systemic insight in a book like that. And then there's two other resources. The livingsystemministry.org is a website that we're developing that it's a little bit out of date, but there's a lot of good materials there. There's a summary of The Cat and the Toaster there in 30 pages if you don't want to read the whole book. And there's a video that I wanted to show today, but the technology doesn't work very well. So I would encourage you to go to the edc.org, click on the communications, and then go to videos. And then there's an introduction to living system ministry video that sort of just reviews some of the things I said, talks about how God makes living systems, and just, again, the cat and the toaster idea, if that's helpful to you. So there you have it. So I'm looking now for any questions.
Thanks, Jeff, for your time. And I just wanted to, before we started fielding questions, let everyone know that we are going to copy the slides and provide it out in the email that will get sent out either later today or tomorrow. So you'll have all those resources and links and all the great graph information. So definitely make sure you have all that.
And like this, the webinar itself will be posted.
Absolutely. The webinar, it will also be taped and put on our YouTube page, and that same email will have a web link to that as well, for sure. Jeff, as we're getting questions, I guess maybe I could start. I wonder, being an organization that has maybe never thought of systems or even system-level questions before, what are some of those kind of initial first steps do you think an organization should take? I know you talked about the tools, but what are some of those first few things that an organization could do to apply a living system to their ministry plan? I know that's a tough question to kind of start, but.
Yeah, and so I'm actually working with an organization now that has asked that very question, and my answer to them is that they need to develop some language around systems. And so I'm going there and doing a training with them around some of the things we talked about here, but just trying to get that systemic language so they actually know what they're talking about when they're talking about systems. Because, again, it's easy to say, I want to take a systemic approach, but it's trickier to actually to dive into it. And I do think that some of the things that I've talked about today, that this doing Biography, just starting to ask questions like this, just realizing there's something deeper, accepting the living system reality that you're in. And talking about that among yourself. So it's hard to do this by yourself. So I think getting the conversation going is one way to do that, okay? I also encourage people to try to diagram their system. And again, something that was more than I could do, it takes longer to sort of train that. But if you go to slide number 33, Mike.
What's the title?
Abolitionist Network Systems Diagram. Okay, so this is an example of a system diagram that we use. So we're always diagramming things. And again, there's no real trick to this. We're just trying to figure out what we're thinking about and put it down on paper so that other people can relate to it. So if you can diagram and say, well, this is what I'm thinking. I'm always making diagrams and pictures, and it allows people to get into your brain more deeply. And so this is an example of a systems diagram about human trafficking. And the key insight here for me is that we all understand that human trafficking is bad, and that the church needs to do things both at the prevention level and at the intervention level. But the inside of this diagram says there's actually three kinds of brokenness that need to happen for human trafficking to work. There needs to be a vulnerable person who gets brought into trafficking, so the person that becomes the prostitute or the person that gets run into it. But there also needs to be an exploiter, a pimp, someone who's willing to exploit that person, and there's brokenness required there. And there's got to be somebody who's willing to be the John, somebody who's willing to be the buyer. And there's brokenness in all three places. And I actually think that's a pretty powerful insight as we think about human trafficking. And this came out of our having conversations and learning about it and then trying to diagram what we're thinking. And that conversation then leads to this, oh, that's a powerful insight that we could all share. And so if people are trying to figure out what this looks like, put down something on paper, show it to somebody else. And it doesn't have to be pretty. These things start out, they're really ugly. We have a lot of bad diagrams. But they get other people thinking with you, and that's a really great approach to start thinking together about the system. Remember the F's. People see different things, and the majority of the people aren't necessarily right. And so looking at it together, talking about it, may give some insight. So if you're looking at that F's on that page, and 70 people or 40 people see 3, and one person, which has happened in one of my classes, one person saw 6, you're not going to listen to that person necessarily. But if you sit down and you talk about it, and that person's able to say, actually see it differently. Can we look at it this way for 1 second? And she said, what about the odds? Oh, yes, and everyone will see it differently. And so just creating space to have these conversations, I think, is the key thing. And then applying some of these tools. There's lots of other tools, but this is how you get the process started.
Good stuff. Thank you. Another quick question, Jeff. You talk a lot about in kind of some of the both the tools really about gathering data. What are some of those key gathering points that a church could look toward to get a better insight into kind of what their community looks like?
Sure. So there's a whole art to studying an urban community, and so we actually have some resources for that at EGC. There's a template that we could provide, and we teach about that. But it's basically, and we always say to people, walk around. Get out in your neighborhood, make a map. What's there? Do you know what's there? Do you know what other churches are there? Do you know what businesses are there? Do you know what people live there? And so there's a lot you can do by walking around, by reading. In Boston, there's books about all the different neighborhoods. You read about the history, you learn about the Germans, and you make a plan in the breweries and why they're there. You start to get a feel for the place, and then at some point you need to start talking to people. And so there's lots of ways to do that. You know, you could ask people how to pray for you. You could ask them what they think the biggest problem they're facing is in the city. But we ask people to get out and sort of talk to people, walk around, and just again, it's pretty simple research, but it's powerful if you just start doing things like that. And when you do that, one thing will lead to another thing. You'll get an insight. You'll develop a friend. A relationship. That friend will ask, "Can the church help me with this?" Well, then you just have an entry point. And so the process starts building on itself. But we got to get outside the walls of the church, and we have to get out into the neighborhood to understand the systems that are there. And if we start inventing, we spend a lot of time with folks that, you know, in their church, this is what we want to do in the neighborhood, and it doesn't relate to the neighborhood because we're not relating to the neighborhood. Or people from outside the city want to come in and help the city without actually getting to know people in the city. And it just doesn't work like that. We want to help Haiti and Haitians from Boston without really connecting with the Haitians on the ground. So we do this a lot. And a systemic approach really respects the fact that you got to get to know a system, understand it, really learn to love it. The positive appreciation is a big part of this. And so that's one of my little testaments. If you don't love the people in your neighborhood, if you don't really love and know folks, don't think you can minister to them. You know, so the first step is to go get to know them and start loving them. And so if you go look at our Living System Ministry website, there's a section called the process of the gospel. And that's another model of this that creates entry points by observing God so loved the world that He sent His Son, relating, meeting felt needs, meeting real needs. Yeah. So I hope that gets at your question a little bit.
Absolutely. Jeff, we do thank you a lot for your time. I don't see any other questions. Want to be cognizant of everybody else's time. It was very informative and just wanted to challenge everyone to look at those resources that Jeff has provided. It's a great list. We'll be sure to send the slides out. And I'm sure if you had any questions as well, Jeff would love to field any questions that you would have specifically, post webinar. Maybe I could also provide Jeff's contact information in there.
Sure.
Jeff, is that all right?
Yeah, no problem.
Quickly, we have one quick question. I'm going to just grab it real fast. How do you start a systems diagram? Do you start with the goals or the obstacles?
I would start with the components. So what is it you're talking about? Just put down on a paper what are the parts of the system, and then show how those things relate to each other. So we often just put down the things that we care about, and then we start drawing arrows between them. And then you try to figure out what arrows are important, see if it tells a story, and then from there you can start to move towards goals and obstacles. But you want to start with components and relationships. That's what defines a system.
Absolutely. Good stuff. Again, I want to make sure we leave on time, and just wanted to, again, thank you everyone for attending. And Jeff, thank you very much for your time. And hopefully we'll be able to see you next month. We'll have Keith Tolley, who is a consultant for Vision New England and also a lead pastor for a church in Greenfield, Massachusetts. He'll be talking about developing a disciple-making disciple system. So that'll be happening on April 16th, and we'll send some more information out. So again, thank you everyone for attending and spending some time with us this month. Hopefully we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.